It's Emily OFC Podfic. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 7. Tenzō did his best to seem casual as he took a seat on the couch across from the armchair Kakashi was lounging in. He had a magazine in his hand, but it was more of a prop than anything else. It had been the top one on the stack, just an explanation for why he was there if one became necessary. Truthfully, he was hoping to strike up a conversation with his new lieutenant. He wanted to thank him properly for the advice he had given him at the department holiday party and make sure he was establishing a good reputation for himself. He remembered how Kakashi had said he knew almost everyone in the department, and although networking wasn't Tenzō's forte, he'd have to be completely inept not to recognize this as an opportunity. Kakashi was seated where he had been for a few hours now, reclined in a leather armchair, engrossed in a well-worn book that Tenzō couldn't see the name of, blocked as it was by the other man's grip on it. It must have been engaging, whatever it was, because he didn't seem to notice Tenzō's presence at all. When they had returned from the false alarm at the high school, Kakashi had disappeared briefly, and then, when everyone had made themselves comfortable with their activity of choice in the rec room, he had reappeared, a DVD in hand, and wordlessly inserted it into the DVD player attached to the large flat-screen TV in the room. Within seconds, the words "Forcible Entry Basics" had flashed on the screen. It was a training video. There were eye rolls and a few displeased grunts, but the crew had begrudgingly turned to face the screen and sat through the 45-minute video without complaint. It had been a good move, Tenzō had thought. It was undoubtedly the easiest of their outstanding training requirements to complete. It made it evident that they would be doing a lot more training than they had under Jiraiya, but it wasn't so heavy-handed that it incited mutiny. It was a fine line, and Kakashi had walked it well. There had only been a few call-outs for the rest of the day, and all had been medical, which didn't require the lieutenant to go out, and so Tenzō hadn't seen much of him at all. He'd retreated into the captain's office and closed the door behind him once the training video had been completed. Around 8 p.m., though, Kakashi had emerged, bypassed the rest of the crew in the combination kitchen rec room, and turned instead into the station's small library, a room that got little use from what Tenzō had seen in his time at Station 10. Tenzō had given it some time to see if Kakashi would join them eventually, but after a few hours, he had made the decision to approach the man in the library instead. Tenzō was holding the magazine in front of his face, but was peering over the top of it as inconspicuously as he could, wondering if it would be rude to interrupt Kakashi while he was reading. He had hoped that perhaps the other man would have struck up a conversation when he'd entered the room, but it had been at least 5 minutes now, and Kakashi hadn't moved apart from to turn a page. Should he clear his throat? Would that seem disruptive? Tenzō shifted some in his seat on the sofa. He heard the sounds of the muffled TV from the rec room through the wall. Perhaps he should have stayed there. "You seem to be very fixated on that magazine page." Kakashi's voice pierced the silence so suddenly that Tenzō nearly jumped. "Is it a particularly fascinating article?" Tenzō stared at Kakashi. He hadn't even seen the man look up from his book. In fact, he still hadn't looked up from his book, though apparently he had been well aware of Tenzō's presence. Tenzō reached for an answer to the question he had been asked. Truthfully, he hadn't even absorbed what was on the page in front of him. As he looked at it now, he saw that it featured a close-up picture of a woman in yoga pants. The page's header read, "Amp up your booty workout with these at-home tools." Tenzō grimaced at the page. He said hurriedly, flipping the magazine around to check the cover. Cosmopolitan. Of course he'd picked up Cosmopolitan. "No," he answered. "I wasn't really reading, I guess." Tenzō set the magazine down on the coffee table between them. Kakashi lowered his book finally and fixed Tenzō with a serious-looking stare. "You weren't? That's too bad. I was going to ask your opinion about..." He leaned forward over the table, squinting at the magazine's cover.
11 nipple clamps to invest in ASAP.
Tenzō's face was suddenly very hot as he shook his head a little too aggressively. It was just the top one on the pile. He tried in his defense. This conversation was not at all going to plan. Perhaps he really should have stayed in the rec room. Kakashi's serious demeanor cracked unexpectedly then, and Tenzō watched his eyes close mirthfully as he traded in his pursed lips for a smile. 3 things occurred to Tenzō at that moment. Firstly, that he was being teased and should have realized it right away. Secondly, that the warm, friendly Kakashi he'd met at the holiday party seemed to be back for the time being, as opposed to the more terse man he'd interacted with so far that day. And thirdly, the image that had appeared in his head, unbidden, upon hearing his silver-haired lieutenant utter the words nipple clamps, would need to be suppressed at all costs going forward if he hoped to network with this man professionally.
"What can I do for you?"
Kakashi asked, eyes open now but a smile still playing on his lips. He still held his book, with his thumb keeping his spot between the pages, but let it hang between his knees as he rested his elbows on his thighs. "Oh," Tenzō tried responding, but found he was still a little bit flustered. "Nothing."
"Nothing?"
Kakashi asked, cocking his head to one side, just as Tenzō remembered him doing on the veranda. "No, not really," Tenzō admitted. "I just wanted to let you know that I'm, glad you're here." He looked away momentarily. "You know, even if others aren't." Kakashi eyed him critically for a few seconds, saying nothing, forcing Tenzō to fill the empty space. "I feel better about things when we follow procedure. I know today at the high school was a false alarm, but it won't always be. We've even had a couple of arsons lately, and they can be unpredictable. Everything turned out okay, but I think—" Tenzō trailed off as he saw Kakashi visibly react to what he was saying. Gone was the relaxed posture, replaced with a noticeable air of alarm, evident in his lieutenant's stiffened shoulders and fading smile.
"Tell me about the arsons,"
Kakashi said, leaning forward in his seat. Tenzō felt the hairs on the back of his neck raise in response to the rapid change in demeanor. "Of course," he said. "Like I said, there have been a couple lately. Back in November, we handled one at a gym in Trolley Square."
"Core 10?
Kakashi asked him hurriedly before he could continue. Tenzō nodded. "Yeah, that sounds right. Do you know the place?" Kakashi sat back in his seat. He didn't answer, but instead finally pulled his thumb out from between the pages of his book and set the thing down on the seat cushion beside his thigh.
"Injuries? Fatalities?"
he asked. "None," Tenzō answered. "It happened overnight. The place was doused in gasoline. Probably insurance fraud."
"Right."
Kakashi agreed with him in words, but it didn't seem to reach his eyes.
"And the other one?"
"Bookstore," Tenzō told him. "Only a couple weeks ago. Old books or something like that. Down on the waterfront."
"Shit,"
Kakashi cursed under his breath, turning away from Tenzō to look at the ficus in the corner of the room, one hand rising up to cover his mouth and nose pensively. "You know that place too?" Tenzō asked, unable to hide his curiosity at his lieutenant's emotive reaction.
"Yeah," Kakashi answered from behind his hand. "Didn't even know it was gone."
Then quickly,
"I know pretty much every place, though. I've lived here my whole life."
That one could have been accidental, since the place was full of paper, obviously. But we found the matches and the storekeeper was adamant that they weren't his, Tenzō told him. Kakashi answered, still staring down the somewhat limp plant next to the window. "I found the matches, actually," Tenzō corrected himself quietly, reminding himself that he had been trying to make a good impression on the man in front of him. Kakashi's eyes shifted back to his, though he remained facing the ficus. "That's good," he said without much conviction, and it was clear to Tenzō that his mind was somewhere else. Finally, after a few long moments had passed with only the muffled sounds of the TV from the next room and the ticking of the clock on the wall, Kakashi turned back to face him.
I appreciate the information, Tenzō, and I'm glad you're supportive of me joining the crew,
he said, gaze somewhat calculating. It was strange, for some reason, to hear his lieutenant say his name.
But if you're still concerned with fitting in with your crewmates, you won't win any favors by trying to get in my good graces, even if it works.
Tenzō shook his head. Your advice from the party helped a lot, and thanks for that. But I didn't become a firefighter to make friends. I want to save lives and protect my community. I want to learn from you. Kakashi's smile was back, if a bit less wide than it had been before, and he laughed softly at Tenzō's words.
That makes one of you, then,
he said, running a quick hand through his hair, leaving it unkempt in a way that made him look charming and boyish to Tenzō. The crew will come around, Tenzō insisted, returning a smile of his own. Probably, he qualified. I hope so. Kakashi was smiling wider now, and it set off a few butterflies in Tenzō's stomach. You said you knew Jiraiya. I didn't know him well, but he wasn't much for rules and protocol. It's a change for the crew, and I get it. Most of the time that stuff is unnecessary. It just ends up being extra steps that get in the way of doing the job.
Until it isn't.
Kakashi interrupted him, another dramatic shift in tone evident in his voice, which was no longer light-hearted, but steely and cold.
It's unnecessary until someone goes into a burning building and doesn't come back out.
Tenzō's eyes were wide as he rushed to respond. No, absolutely, I agree. That's where I was going with that, actually. Sorry, I didn't mean to imply otherwise. Kakashi stood up abruptly, wiping his hands on his uniform pants and shaking his head.
No, I'm sorry. My mind is somewhere else right now. I think I'd better head to bed. Good night.
With that, he took his leave, exiting the room out into the hallway and out of view.
Rise and shine.
Asuma's gruff voice was accompanied by a less than gentle punch to Tenzō's bicep, ripping him violently out of his REM sleep. He blinked his eyes open with a sputter and immediately saw the flashing lights that indicated they had a call-out. He'd somehow managed to sleep right through the tones in the announcement that contained the details. It was unlike him to sleep so heavily. Quickly becoming more alert, he slipped on the pair of slides he kept next to his bunk and headed out of the dorms and down the stairs to the engine bay, where his gear would be staged, packed out, and ready to go. Tenzō slept in a department-issued t-shirt and shorts when he was on duty, both of which could be worn under his gear. He always wore his socks to sleep, too. He didn't find it particularly comfortable, and certainly didn't sleep in socks at home, but years on the job had taught him that, by far, the hardest thing to put on when your fingers were still inhibited by lingering sleepiness was a pair of socks. While he hurriedly pulled on his gear alongside his crewmates, he glanced up at the digital display to catch the nature of the call-out so that he could mentally prepare himself. Engine 3, Vehicle Fire, East 22nd and Church Street, it read. 3:23 a.m., added the digital clock below it. Tenzō frowned as he pulled on his boots. A vehicle fire. It was probably the most common type of call-out they got. And, as awful as it sounded, they were more annoying than anything else. Injuries and fatalities were less likely than a civilian might think when it came to vehicle fires. More often than not, the driver and any passengers were safely out by the time a crashed car ignited. Hopefully, it would be a quick one to put out, Tenzō thought, and he could wrangle a few more hours of sleep out of the night before his shift ended. The scene was exactly as Tenzō had expected it to be when they arrived. A gray sedan totaled, its hood bent around a telephone pole. The driver, a young mid-20s woman who had hit a patch of black ice, had exited the vehicle relatively unharmed. She was being looked over by the paramedics who had responded, parked just around the corner. Apart from the hood, not much of the car was visible, as the flames shooting out from the cowl of the vehicle were producing enough smoke to obscure the rest of the body. The flames were nothing spectacular from what Tenzō could see. The only real risk was the fire catching on something else and spreading before they had a chance to put it out. That was unlikely, fortunately, as they were just about ready to begin extinguishing it. Since call-outs like this were basically routine, the crew was working seamlessly. Asuma had parked them several car lengths back and was now fitting the hose onto the closest hydrant with Hayate's help. Law enforcement had successfully diverted traffic, eliminating the obstacle of civilian interference. Kotetsu and Izumo were running the length of hose towards the vehicle. Tenzō and Anko were in position, getting ready to aim and handle the nozzle once the water was turned on. Kakashi was everywhere in between, far more involved than Ibizu had ever been in Tenzō's recollections. Their new lieutenant was with them every step of the way, making sure everyone had what they needed to move as quickly as possible. Just after Kotetsu handed the nozzle off to Tenzō and Anko, Kakashi approached them both, jogging to meet them where they stood several yards back from the blaze, 2 SCBA masks in his hands. He held them out.
"It's a vehicle fire!"
Anko shouted over the crackling of the blaze, shaking her head. Kakashi took another step forward and pushed the mask into her chest.
Class B, full PPE, mask up.
By the book, Kakashi was right. But even Tenzō was surprised that he'd be insisting on an SCBA mask for a fire like this. Yes, all vehicle fires were technically Class B fires, which required full PPE including a mask, but that was mainly because they were tough to classify in general. Vehicle fires ran the gamut from a few sparks popping up out of the hood to full-blown explosions accelerated by leaking gasoline. It was the middle of the night, but the streetlights were bright enough to see. There was no gasoline leak. It was the middle of winter. The fire was confined to the front of the vehicle. There was nothing especially dangerous about this job to warrant the mask. The SCBA masks were, of course, life-saving tools when used in the proper environments, but they also limited visibility and required careful control of oxygen usage. They were a nuisance when not needed. Tenzō wasn't going to argue, though, and he began lowering the back end of the hose nozzle in his hands to the ground, causing Anko, who was holding its handle, to whip her head around to stare at him in surprise. He raised his eyebrows at her, and she only scowled for a moment before beginning to lower her end as well with a huff. They each took their masks from Kakashi, and he nodded in approval once they were fitted. Just as they lifted the hose from the ground again, Izumo jogged up behind Kakashi. "Good to go," he told them.
"Turn her on!"
Anko shouted back, and Tenzō braced himself behind her for the force of the water. Once the water had made its way through the length of the hose and was blasting out from the nozzle head, Tenzō and Anko aimed it at the base of the fire, sweeping across the length of the vehicle slowly, back and forth, dousing the source of the combustion. After a few minutes, the flames began to die out, releasing a thick black smoke, further obscuring the vehicle as it rose up into the sky. Per standard procedure, with Anko taking the lead, they began to approach the sedan, continuing to hose it down until they were just 10 feet or so from the smoldering remains. The fire extinguished. Tenzō raised a hand, signaling for the crew to stop the flow of water, and looked back over his shoulder to ensure his team had seen him. It was hard to tell through his mask and past the circle of light provided by the street lamp above, but either Kotetsu or Izumo was already running back towards the hydrant, and just a few moments later, the force of the spray lessened, slowly petering out.
"Let's check it out,"
Tenzō shouted to be sure he was heard through his mask. Anko responded in the affirmative by beginning to lower her hose nozzle to the ground. Tenzō followed suit. Their next steps would be to approach the vehicle and be sure they saw no further signs of fire before bringing the hose back in and letting the smoke clear, eventually releasing the car to a tow truck and assisting with getting it loaded. Within just a few seconds, they were at the hood of the vehicle. It was easily seen now, though it would have been easier without the SCBA. The worst of the smoke had cleared, and what was left was billowing up and away from them due to the direction of the wind. Just as Anko was leaning over the hood of the car to inspect the cowl for any indication of remaining embers, they were interrupted by a loud, urgent shout.
"Get back!"
Tenzō whipped his head around to see Kakashi, silhouetted in front of Engine 3's headlights, gesturing frantically for them to back away from the vehicle. Tenzō felt his heart rate quicken rapidly. He swung back around to the car. Nothing had changed. There was no flame. In front of him, Anko's head was on a swivel as well, looking for the threat.
Anko! Tenzō! Back off now!
Kakashi's voice was harsh and raw with the effort of his shouting, and it was enough to spur both of them into action, backing away from the car, Tenzō's eyes still urgently searching for whatever it was Kakashi thought he saw. Just as they stepped back past where they had laid the hose nozzle to rest, with seemingly no explanation, the car reignited in a violent flash, flames shooting up from the cowl again, a small explosion accompanying them, briefly enveloping Anko, who was a few steps in front of Tenzō. The flaming gas retreated just as quickly as it had expanded, sinking back into the base of the flames, which now rose at least twice as high as they had initially. Anko tripped and stumbled back, crashing hard into Tenzō and sending them both to the ground at the edge of the light from the street lamp above. Tenzō was breathing hard, staring wide-eyed at the fire that had reappeared as if they had never put it out in the first place. His mind was telling him to get up, but his body wouldn't move from where it was, splayed out on the asphalt. Then, movement to his left forced him to turn his head, and he saw Kakashi pulling Anko to her feet. Tenzō, finally unfrozen, scrambled to standing as well, jogging along behind them as Kakashi led Anko to the back of the engine, seating her on its ledge. Tenzō took off his mask, staring first at Kakashi, who was shouting directions to the rest of the crew who were getting in position to start the water back up, Asuma suiting up to hold the nozzle, and then turning back to the inexplicable flames. The water started again, and Tenzō watched as they began dousing the fire again, suddenly feeling very far away from it all.
Anko, I said, are you okay?
Kakashi's voice ripped Tenzō's attention away from the scene and back to his crewmate, back to the moment. Kakashi had both of his hands on Anko's shoulders. Anko was still seated on the engine's bumper, mask on, eyes wide and transfixed on the blaze like Tenzō must have been a moment before. At Kakashi's words, though, she, too, appeared to snap out of it, reaching up and ripping off her SCBA mask, gasping in a lungful of cold night air before responding. "Yes," she answered, looking between the two of them and then back to Asuma and the fire. "Yes," she repeated. "Fuck! What the fuck?" Kakashi seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. He dropped his hands from Anko's shoulders. "Hold on," he said, before jogging around the side of the engine and disappearing inside. He reappeared seconds later, a thermal imaging camera in hand. He positioned himself in front of them, pointing the camera at the blaze.
"It's a hybrid car!"
he called out to Asuma, who was looking at him questioningly.
"Keep going!"
Tenzō squinted through the smoke. Kakashi was right. It was a Prius. Usually they were very recognizable, but this was an early model, and it hardly differed from any other older sedan.
"I didn't notice until the smoke cleared,"
Kakashi called back to him and Anko over his shoulder.
"These damn lithium batteries are like trick birthday candles. You've got to keep them wet until the temperature comes down or they reignite."
Right. Tenzō knew that about hybrids and electric cars, but they hadn't known they were dealing with one. He turned to look back at Anko. Her eyes were fixed on the fire still, her blown pupils reflecting its flickering coppery colors. She had a white-knuckled death grip on the SCBA mask in her hands. It's Emily OFC Podfics.